After paying for an elderly man's gasoline, the manager fires her 2 hours later. Everyone was buzzing with excitement. The morning was cold and gray when Sophie arrived at the gas station to start her shift. The smell of fuel and the constant coming and going of vehicles were already part of her daily routine. At 35, Sophie had been working at this place for over a decade. And although the job wasn't glamorous, it allowed her to support her teenage daughter, Lucy, and help her mother, Isabel, with medical expenses. As she adjusted her blue uniform with the station's logo, Sophie glanced out the window as she finished adjusting her uniform, watching the clouds threaten to unleash a storm at any moment. Her shift partners, Carl and Martha, were already at their posts, ready for another workday. "Good morning," Sophie greeted with a tired but sincere smile. Carl, a middle-aged man with a perpetual scowl, only grunted in response. Martha, younger and more energetic, returned the greeting enthusiastically. "Hey, Soph, ready for another exciting day in fuel paradise?" Martha joked. Sophie chuckled softly. "As ready as I'll ever be. Anything new?" "Not really," Martha replied, although the boss did say he might drop by later for a surprise inspection. Sophie felt a pang of worry. Surprise inspections always made her nervous, even though she knew she did her job well. With a sigh, she headed to her spot at the register. The hours passed with the usual monotony, customers coming and going, the bell jingling each time the door opened, and the constant hum of the fuel pumps. Sophie served each customer with a friendly smile, despite her fatigue. It was around noon when everything changed. The bell rang once more, and Sophie looked up to see an elderly man walking in. He moved slowly and unsteadily, leaning on a cane. His face was etched with deep wrinkles, but his blue eyes still had a spark of life that contrasted with his frail appearance. The old man approached the counter, and Sophie noticed he seemed confused and distressed. "Welcome, sir. How can I help you?" Sophie asked kindly. The man looked at her, appearing lost for a moment. Then, as if he suddenly remembered why he was there, he spoke in a trembling voice. I filled up my car's tank, but I can't find my wallet. I don't know where I left it." His hands shook as he searched through the pockets of his worn-out jacket. Sophie felt a wave of compassion. "Don't worry, sir. How much was the gasoline?" "I think it was 50 pounds, the old man replied, his voice breaking with embarrassment. "But I can't pay it? I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do." Sophie glanced around. Carl was busy with another customer, and Martha had gone on her break. Without thinking twice, Sophie made a decision that would change the course of her life. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'll take care of it." The man looked at her, surprised and grateful. "But how? I can't accept that." Sophie smiled gently. "I insist. We all need help sometimes. What's your name, sir?" "Lucas," he replied, his eyes welling up with tears. "My name is Lucas." "Well, Lucas, I'm Sophie. Don't worry about it. Consider it an act of kindness." With trembling hands, Sophie took out her own money and registered it in the system as a normal transaction. Lucas watched her, still in disbelief at the kindness of a stranger. "I don't know how to thank you," Lucas said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You're an angel." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. "It's nothing really. Just promise me you'll be careful and remember your wallet next time." Lucas nodded vigorously. "I promise. I'll never forget your kindness, Sophie." As Lucas slowly made his way back to his car, Sophie felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, she was satisfied that she had helped someone in need. On the other, she knew she had just spent money she could hardly afford to lose. What Sophie didn't know at that moment was that her act of kindness had not gone unnoticed. Carl, who had finished with his customer, had witnessed the whole scene from afar. His scowl deepened as he watched Lucas drive away. "What the hell did you just do, Sophie?" Carl asked, approaching the counter. Sophie jumped, startled. She hadn't realized Carl was there. "I just helped an elderly man who couldn't pay for his gasoline." Carl let out a sarcastic laugh. "Helped? What you did was give away the company's money. Do you really think that old man wasn't tricking you?" "It wasn't a scam, Carl," Sophie replied, her cheeks flushing. "He was an old, confused man. I couldn't just leave him stranded." "Well, you should have," Carl shot back. It's not our problem if people can't pay. You just violated company policy, and you know that. Before Sophie could respond, the door opened again, and Martha returned from her break. Noticing the tension in the air, she looked from Carl to Sophie. "What did I miss?" she asked. Carl wasted no time explaining what had happened, painting Sophie's actions as a severe infraction. Martha's eyes widened as she listened. "Sophie, is that true?" Martha asked, incredulous. "Did you really pay for a customer's gasoline with your own money?" Sophie nodded, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Yes, I did. He was an old man who forgot his wallet. I couldn't just leave him stranded." Martha shook her head. "Oh, Sophie, you have a heart of gold. But this could get you in trouble. What if the boss finds out?" "The boss will find out," Carl growled. "I'll make sure of it. We can't let people take advantage of us." Sophie felt panic start to rise. "Please, Carl, there's no need to involve the boss. It won't happen again." But Carl had already pulled out his phone and was dialing. "Sorry, Sophie, but it's my duty to report this." As Carl spoke on the phone, Sophie leaned against the counter, feeling like the world was closing in on her. How had she gone from doing what she believed was right to standing on the edge of losing her job? Martha put a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I'm sorry, sophomore. I know you meant well, but rules are rules." Sophie nodded silently, her mind spinning. She thought of Lucy, her mother Isabel, and the bills she had to pay. What would she do if she lost this job? The rest of the day was a blur of anxiety for Sophie. Each time the doorbell rang, she feared it was the boss coming to fire her. Carl kept shooting her disapproving looks whenever their paths crossed, while Martha tried to cheer her up with awkward smiles. When it was finally time to close, Sophie was emotionally and physically drained. She removed her uniform mechanically, wishing she could erase the events of the day. "Sophie," Martha called as she was about to leave. "The boss called. He wants to see you first thing tomorrow morning in his office." Sophie felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She nodded weakly and stepped out into the cold night, wondering how a simple act of kindness could have unleashed such chaos in her life. As she walked to the bus stop, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Lucas, the elderly man she had helped. Had he made it home safely? Would he be all right? For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, in some way, this act of kindness would bring positive change to her life. But as the bus pulled up to her stop, reality hit her hard. Tomorrow, she might lose her job, and with it, the stability she had worked so hard to build for her family. With a heavy heart, Sophie boarded the bus, unaware that her life was about to take an unexpected turn. The next morning dawned gray and rainy, as if the weather itself mirrored Sophie's mood. She got up early, long before her alarm, after a restless night filled with nightmares about losing her job. In the kitchen, she found her daughter Lucy already awake, making breakfast. At 16, Lucy was responsible and mature for her age, aware of the sacrifices her mother made for her. "Good morning, Mom," Lucy greeted, noticing the worried look on her mother's face. "Are you okay? You look pale." Sophie tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." Lucy wasn't convinced. "Mom, I know you. Something's wrong." "What is it?" Sophie sighed, sitting down at the kitchen table. She knew she couldn't hide the truth from her daughter, not when the consequences could impact the whole family. "Something happened at work yesterday," Sophie began. "I helped a customer who couldn't pay for his gasoline. I paid for it with my own money." Lucy's eyes widened in surprise. "But, Mom, that was so kind of you. Why would that be a bad thing?" "Because it goes against company policy," Sophie explained. "And now the boss wants to see me this morning. I'm afraid I might lose my job." Lucy dropped the spatula she was holding, the metallic clatter echoing in the small kitchen. "But that's not fair. You were just being a good person." "I know, sweetheart," Sophie replied, feeling a lump in her throat. "But sometimes, good intentions aren't enough." Lucy came over and hugged her mother tightly. "It has to be okay, Mom. You're the best person I know." Sophie hugged her daughter back, grateful for her support. At that moment, they heard footsteps approaching, and the kitchen door opened to reveal Isabel, Sophie's mother. Isabel, a 65-year-old woman with silver hair and the same warm eyes as Sophie, entered the kitchen, leaning on her cane. Despite her health problems, Isabel had always been a pillar of strength for the family. "Good morning, my loves," Isabel greeted, but her smile faded when she saw the serious expressions on her daughter and granddaughter's faces. "What's wrong? You look like you're at a funeral." Sophie told her mother what had happened, while Lucy finished preparing breakfast in silence. Isabel listened intently, her face shifting from concern to indignation. "That's ridiculous," Isabel exclaimed when Sophie finished her story. "Firing someone for showing compassion? What kind of world is this? One where rules sometimes come before humanity," Sophie replied bitterly. "Listen to me, Sophie," Isabel said, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "No matter what happens today, remember you did the right thing. If your boss can't see that, then he doesn't deserve to have you as an employee." Sophie smiled faintly, grateful for her family's support. "Thank you, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you too." They had breakfast together, trying to keep the conversation light despite the tension hanging in the air. When it was time for Sophie to leave, both Lucy and Isabel hugged her tightly. "Good luck, Mom," Lucy said. "We'll be thinking of you." "Show them what you're made of, my girl," Isabel added. "And remember, no matter what, we'll be here for you." With her heart feeling a little lighter thanks to her family's support, Sophie made her way to the gas station. The rain had eased, but the sky remained gray and ominous, reflecting the uncertainty she felt. When she arrived, she saw the boss's car already parked outside the office. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she walked inside. The boss, Andrew Smith, was a man in his 50s with graying hair and a perpetually serious expression. He was sitting behind his desk when Sophie entered the small office. "Good morning, Sophie," Andrew said in a neutral tone. "Please have a seat." Sophie sat down, her hands clasped in her lap to hide their trembling. "Good morning, Mr. Smith." Andrew studied her for a moment before speaking. "Sophie, I've been informed about an incident that occurred yesterday. Can you tell me your side of the story?" Sophie nodded and began explaining what had happened with Lucas, the elderly man who couldn't pay for his gasoline. As she spoke, she noticed Andrew's expression soften slightly. When she finished, Andrew let out a deep sigh. "I understand your intentions, Sophie, truly," he said. "But you have to understand that we have policies in place for a reason." "I know, sir," Sophie replied, her voice catching in her throat. "And I assure you it won't happen again." Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "The problem is it already happened, and as a manager, I can't ignore a direct violation of our policies." Sophie felt her heart sink. "Mr. Smith, please, this job means everything to me. I have a daughter and a mother who depend on me." "I know, Sophie," Andrew said, and for a moment he seemed genuinely sorry. "But I have to think about what's best for the company. I'm sorry, but I have no other choice. You're fired." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. "Please, Mr. Smith, there has to be another way. I can work extra hours, take a pay cut, anything," but Andrew shook his head. "My decision is final, Sophie. You can collect your things and leave. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you." With legs that felt like they were made of lead, Sophie stood up. It felt like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She left the office in a daze, barely registering the sympathetic glances from her co-workers as she gathered her belongings. As she stepped out of the gas station for the last time, the rain had begun to fall harder. Sophie let the cold drops mix with the tears streaming down her face. How was she going to tell Lucy and Isabel that she had lost her job? She walked aimlessly for a while, unable to face the thought of going home and delivering the news. Eventually, she found herself in a small park near her house. She sat down on a wet bench, not caring about the cold or the dampness. As she sat there, trying to process what had just happened, she heard a familiar voice. "Sophie, is that you?" She looked up to see Ellen, her neighbor and friend for years, hurrying over, concern written all over her face. "What's happened? Are you all right?" Ellen asked, sitting beside her and shielding her with an umbrella. Sophie, unable to hold back her emotions any longer, broke down in sobs and told Ellen everything. Ellen listened quietly, rubbing Sophie's back in an attempt to comfort her. When Sophie finished her story, Ellen spoke with determination. Listen to me, Sophie. What happened to you is unfair, but it's not the end of the world. You're strong and capable. You'll find another job. But how? Sophie asked desperately. Who's going to hire someone who was fired for helping a customer? Ellen gave her a gentle smile. Someone who values compassion and integrity. Until you find that job, you're not alone. You have friends, you have family. We'll help you. Ellen's words were like a soothing balm to Sophie's wounded heart. For the first time since she left the office, she felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Ellen, Sophie said, wiping her tears. I don't know what I'd do without you. That's what friends are for, Ellen replied. Now let's get you home. Your family needs you, and you need them. Together, they walked back to Sophie's house. When they arrived, Lucy and Isabel were waiting anxiously in the living room. The moment they saw Sophie's face, they knew what had happened. Lucy rushed to hug her mother, while Isabel moved as quickly as she could with her cane. "Oh, Mom," Lucy said, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. We're here for you, my girl," Isabel added, joining the embrace. Sophie let herself be surrounded by the love of her family, feeling that, despite everything, she was not alone. Ellen watched the scene from the doorway, a mix of sadness and determination on her face. "Sophie," Ellen called, catching everyone's attention. "I have an idea. My brother works in human resources at a large company. Let me talk to him and see if he can help you find something." Sophie felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Ellen. I don't know how to thank you enough." "You don't have to," Ellen replied with a smile. "Just promise me you won't lose hope." As Ellen left, promising to come back with news soon, Sophie sat down with her family and told them everything, from the incident with Lucas to her conversation with Andrew. "That man doesn't know what he's lost," Isabel said firmly. "Any company would be lucky to have you." "Mom," Lucy said, her voice full of determination, "I could quit school and get a job to help out." "Absolutely not," Sophie replied immediately. "Your education is the most important thing. We'll find a way to get through this without you sacrificing your future." Despite the uncertainty that loomed over them, the family grew even closer. They spent the rest of the day together, making plans, comforting each other, and even laughing occasionally. That night, as Sophie prepared for bed, she looked out the window at the dark, rainy street. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it with the same compassion and strength that had always defined her. What Sophie couldn't know was that elsewhere in the city, the events she had set in motion with her act of kindness were about to take an unexpected turn that would change her life forever. The next day dawned bright and clear, as if the sky wanted to lift Sophie's spirits. She got up early and carefully dressed, choosing a blue blouse that Lucy always said looked good on her and black pants. She wanted to make a good impression, though she wasn't sure why it felt so important. As she arrived at a small cafe near her house, she felt a mix of nervousness and curiosity about what was to come. When she stepped inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pastries greeted her. She spotted a man in his mid-40s sitting alone at a table in the corner. When their eyes met, he stood and gestured for her to come over. "Sophie?" he asked as she approached. Sophie studied the man in front of her. He had dark hair streaked with gray and warm eyes behind thin-framed glasses. He wore a casual but well-tailored suit. "I'm Diego Vasquez." He introduced himself, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Sophie shook his hand and sat down, still feeling a bit uneasy. "Mr. Vasquez, what is this about?" Diego smiled, a mixture of gratitude and something Sophie couldn't quite place. Nostalgia, perhaps. "Of course," Diego said, "but first, would you mind if we ordered something?" "My treat," Sophie agreed, and soon they had 2 steaming cups of coffee and a plate of pastries in front of them. Diego took a sip of his coffee before speaking. "Sophie, do you remember an elderly man you helped at the gas station a few weeks ago? A man who couldn't pay for his gasoline?" Sophie's heart raced. How did this man know about that? "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I remember." Diego nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "That man was my father, Lucas Vasquez." Sophie was speechless, trying to process the information. "Your father? But how?" "My father has Alzheimer's," Diego explained, his voice tinged with sadness. That day, he had wandered away from home. When we finally found him, he wouldn't stop talking about an angel named Sophie who had helped him at the gas station. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. I just did what I thought was right. Diego looked at her with a mix of gratitude and admiration. What you did was more than right, Sophie. It was an extraordinary act of kindness, and that's why I'm here today. Sophie waited, sensing that something important was coming. You see, Diego continued, I haven't told you everything. I own that gas station. Sophie nearly spilled her coffee in shock. You own the gas station? But then, Diego nodded. Yes, I know everything that happened that day and in the days that followed. I know you were fired for helping my father. Sophie felt a whirlwind of emotions. Confusion, surprise, and a glimmer of hope she was afraid to nurture. Mr. Vasquez, Diego held up a hand. Please call me Diego. And let me finish. When I found out what had happened, I felt terrible. Not just about the injustice of your firing, but that my own company had punished such a pure act of kindness. He paused, taking another sip of his coffee before continuing. I've spent the last few weeks investigating, talking to your former coworkers, and to the manager. Everyone speaks so highly of you, Sophie. Your work ethic, your kindness, your dedication. Sophie blushed at the praise, unsure of what to say. And that's why, Diego went on, leaning forward, I want to offer you something. I want to offer you the position of general manager of the gas station. Sophie's mouth dropped open, certain she had misheard. What? But how? I don't have experience as a manager. Diego smiled. You have something far more valuable than experience, Sophie. You have integrity, compassion, and a huge heart. Those are the qualities I want in someone running my business. Sophie felt dizzy. It was too good to be true. But what about the current manager? Armando? Diego's expression hardened slightly. Armando will be reassigned to another location. His handling of the situation showed me that he doesn't share the values I want for my company. Sophie sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything she was hearing. It felt as though the universe had decided to reward her for her act of kindness in the most unexpected way possible. I don't know what to say, she finally whispered. Diego smiled warmly. You don't have to decide right now. I understand it's an unexpected offer and a big change. Take a couple of days to think about it. He slid a business card across the table. Call me when you've made your decision. Sophie took the card with trembling hands, still unable to believe what was happening. Thank you, she managed to say. Thank you for this opportunity. I'll think it over carefully. Diego nodded, standing up. It's the least I can do after what you did for my father. And Sophie, he added, his voice full of sincerity, no matter what you decide, know that people like you make the world a better place. With that, Diego left the cafe, leaving Sophie sitting there, staring at the card in her hand as if she had just woken up from a dream. When she finally got up to leave, she felt like she was floating. She walked home in a daze, trying to process everything that had just happened. When she arrived, Lucy and Isabel were waiting anxiously in the living room. Mom! Lucy exclaimed, running to her. How did it go? Who was that man? Are you okay? Isabel approached more slowly, leaning on her cane, but with the same worried and curious expression. Sophie collapsed onto the couch, suddenly feeling exhausted but exhilarated. Sit down, she told them. I have something incredible to tell you. For the next hour, Sophie recounted everything that had happened at the cafe. She told them about Diego, his father Lucas, and the surprising job offer. Lucy and Isabel listened with wide eyes, occasionally interrupting with exclamations of amazement. When Sophie finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before Lucy jumped up. Mom, that's incredible, she shouted, hugging Sophie. You have to accept. Isabel, calmer but with her eyes shining with excitement, nodded. Sophie, my dear, this is a wonderful opportunity. It's like the universe is repaying your kindness 1,000 times over. Sophie smiled, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I know it's amazing, but what if I'm not up to it? I've never been a manager before. Nonsense, Isabel said firmly. You're smart, hardworking, and you have a heart of gold. That's more valuable than any experience. Besides, Lucy added, Diego believes in you for a reason. He knows the business and chose you. Sophie looked at her daughter and her mother, overwhelmed by their support and faith in her. You're right, she said finally. I'm going to accept. I'll give it everything I have. That night, after dinner and more words of encouragement from her family, Sophie sat on her bed with her phone in her hand and Diego's card in front of her. She took a deep breath and dialed the number. Diego answered on the second ring. Hello. Hi, Diego, Sophie said, surprised at the steadiness in her own voice. It's Sophie Mendoza. I made my decision. I accept your offer. She could hear the smile in Diego's voice. That's wonderful news, Sophie. You won't regret it. How about we meet tomorrow to discuss the details? Sounds perfect, Sophie replied. After agreeing on a time and place for the meeting, Sophie hung up, feeling both nervous and exhilarated. She knew she had a big challenge ahead, but she also felt that she was on the right path. As she prepared to sleep, Sophie thought about how one simple act of kindness had set off a chain of events that had transformed her life. She drifted off to sleep with a smile on her lips, eager to see what the future would bring. What Sophie didn't know was that her adventure was just beginning, and her new job would bring challenges and surprises she could never have imagined. The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if the sky itself wanted to celebrate Sophie's new beginning. She dressed carefully, choosing a tailored suit she had saved for special occasions. As she looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting her necklace, she couldn't help but smile. It was as if she were looking at a new version of herself, a more confident, hopeful Sophie. Lucy came into the room, already dressed for school. Are you ready, Mom? She asked with a proud smile. Sophie nodded, taking a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. In the kitchen, Isabel had prepared breakfast. Eat well, my dear, she said, serving a generous portion of scrambled eggs. You'll need your energy for your big day. As they ate, the family chatted excitedly about the possibilities that lay ahead. The atmosphere was electric, full of hope and anticipation. Remember, Isabel said as Sophie was getting ready to leave, you can do anything you set your mind to. Go show them what you're made of. With one last hug for her mother and daughter, Sophie left the house, ready to face her new challenge. The meeting with Diego was scheduled at the company's headquarters, a modern building in the heart of the city. When Sophie walked into the lobby, she felt momentarily overwhelmed by the grandeur of the place. Taking a deep breath, she followed the receptionist's directions to a conference room with a stunning view of the city. Welcome, Sophie, Diego said, gesturing for her to sit. I'm thrilled you accepted our offer. Over the next few hours, Diego detailed her new responsibilities as the general manager. Sophie listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. As the conversation progressed, she realized that while the job would be challenging, she was more than ready to take it on. There's one more thing you should know, Diego said, his tone growing serious. As I mentioned, my father has Alzheimer's. His condition has worsened, and sometimes he wanders off. Sophie nodded, remembering her encounter with Lucas. I'd like to ask you a personal favor, Diego continued. If you ever see my father at the gas station, or if you hear of anyone seeing him, could you call me immediately? Here's my personal number, he said, writing it on a piece of paper. Of course, Sophie replied without hesitation. I'll do whatever I can to help. Diego smiled, clearly relieved. Thank you, Sophie. I knew I could count on you. When the meeting ended, Sophie left the building feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. She had a lot to learn, but she was ready for the challenge. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Sophie threw herself into her new role, quickly learning the ins and outs of the business. Her compassionate approach and unwavering work ethic soon earned her the respect of her employees. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Some of her former co-workers, especially Carl, resented her sudden promotion. Sophie had to navigate these tensions carefully, balancing authority with empathy. One afternoon, a week after starting her new job, Sophie was in her office reviewing monthly reports when Martha, now her assistant, rushed in. Sophie, Martha said, breathless, there's an elderly man causing trouble in the shop. I think it might be Mr. Vasquez's father. Sophie immediately stood up. Thanks, Martha. I'll handle it. When she reached the shop, she saw Lucas, agitated and arguing with a customer. The old man looked confused and distressed. "This is my gas station," Lucas shouted. "You can't kick me out." Sophie approached calmly, her heart pounding. "Mr. Lucas," she said gently, "do you remember me? I'm Sophie." Lucas looked at her, confusion clouding his eyes. For a moment, he seemed not to recognize her, but then his face lit up. "Sophie, the angel from the gas station." Sophie smiled, relieved. "That's right, Mr. Lucas. Why don't you come with me? We can have a cup of coffee and chat." With care and patience, Sophie managed to calm Lucas and lead him to her office, where Martha brought them coffee. Sophie discreetly called Diego. "Diego, it's Sophie," she said quietly. "Your father is here at the gas station. He's safe, but I think you should come and get him." "I'm on my way," Diego replied, his voice filled with worry. "Thank you, Sophie." Over the next hour, Sophie kept Lucas entertained, listening to his stories about the gas station. Though many of his words were jumbled, Sophie caught glimpses of the man he used to be, a passionate businessman and a loving father. When Diego arrived, out of breath and looking worried, he found his father laughing with Sophie over an old story. "Diego!" Lucas exclaimed when he saw his son. "Look who's here. It's Sophie the angel. I hired her to run the station." Diego's eyes met Sophie's, filled with gratitude. He mouthed a silent, "Thank you." "Dad," Diego said aloud, "it's time to go home. Mom is waiting for us for dinner." Lucas frowned for a moment, but then smiled. "Oh yes, your mother hates it when we're late for dinner." Turning to Sophie, he said, "It was a pleasure to see you, Sophie. Take good care of my gas station." Sophie, moved, replied, "I will, Mr. Lucas. You can count on it." As Diego helped his father out, he paused for a moment. "Sophie, I can't thank you enough. You handled that beautifully." Sophie smiled. "There's nothing to thank me for, Diego. I'm just glad I could help." After they left, Sophie sat in her office for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. The incident had reminded her of why she was there, why this job was more than just a job. It was an opportunity to make a difference, to show compassion in a world that often lacked it. The following days brought new challenges. Sophie had to deal with disgruntled employees, demanding customers, and the complex details of managing a business. But she faced each obstacle with the same determination and kindness that had defined her since the day she helped Lucas. One evening, as she was closing up the office, Carl approached her. He had been one of her harshest critics since her promotion, and Sophie braced herself for another confrontation. "Sophie," Carl began, his voice unusually soft, "I wanted to apologize." Sophie looked at him, surprised. "Apologize?" Carl nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, I've been unfair to you. I was jealous of your promotion, and, well, I was wrong. I saw how you handled Mr. Vasquez's father the other day. It was impressive." Sophie felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you, Carl. That means a lot to me. You're a good boss, Sophie," Carl continued. "And you were right that day when you helped that old man. Sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following the rules to the letter." With those words, Carl walked away, leaving Sophie feeling deeply moved. She had faced many challenges in the past weeks, but moments like this reminded her that she was on the right path. That night, as she had dinner with Lucy and Isabel, Sophie shared the story about Carl's apology. "Mom," Lucy said, her eyes shining with pride, "you're showing everyone how amazing you are." Isabel nodded, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I always knew you'd do great things, my girl. I'm so proud of you." Sophie looked at her family, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said. "Your support means everything to me." As Sophie prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. From being on the brink of unemployment and despair, she now held a position where she could make a real difference. But as she drifted off to sleep, Sophie had no idea that her greatest challenge was still to come. A challenge that would test everything she had learned and change the course of her life once more. Months passed, and Sophie settled into her role as general manager. Under her leadership, the gas station thrived. She implemented new customer-focused policies, improved working conditions for employees, and streamlined operations. Revenues increased, and staff morale was at an all-time high. However, as her first anniversary in the role approached, a series of events began to unfold that threatened everything Sophie had worked so hard for. It all started on a Friday afternoon when Sophie received an urgent call from Diego. "Sophie," Diego's voice was tense. "I need you to come to the central office immediately. There's a serious situation." Intrigued and a bit worried, Sophie headed to the office. When she arrived, she found Diego pacing nervously. "What's going on, Diego?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Diego stopped and looked at her, fear and determination in his eyes. "Sophie, the company is in serious trouble," he said. "Grave trouble?" Over the next hour, Diego explained the situation. An internal audit had revealed significant financial irregularities dating back several years, long before Sophie joined the company. The former financial director had apparently been embezzling funds and falsifying reports. "If this gets out," Diego said, running a hand through his hair in frustration, "it could be the end of the company. Hundreds of people could lose their jobs." Sophie sat down, feeling as if the ground were shifting beneath her. "What can we do?" Diego looked at her, and she saw an internal struggle in his eyes. I have a proposal, but I'm not sure it's the right thing to do." With growing unease, Sophie listened as Diego outlined his plan. He wanted her to help cover up the irregularities, at least temporarily, while they worked to fix the situation internally. "I know it's a lot to ask," Diego said, his voice almost pleading, "but think about all the employees, their families. If the company goes under, everyone suffers." Sophie sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. On one hand, she understood Diego's concern for the employees. She had grown close to many of them, and the thought of them losing their jobs broke her heart. Plus, she owed a lot to Diego, who had given her a second chance when she needed it most. But on the other hand, participating in a cover-up went against everything she believed in. Wasn't this the kind of unethical behavior she had vowed to fight? "Diego," Sophie said finally, her voice shaky but resolute. "I understand your concern. I really do. But I can't be part of this. It's not right." Diego looked at her, a mixture of disappointment and respect in his eyes. "I understand, Sophie. And part of me knew you'd say that. It's one of the reasons I respect you so much." Sophie stood, feeling emotionally drained. "There has to be another way, Diego. A way to face this head-on with honesty. Maybe if we're transparent about what's happened and present a clear plan to fix it, we can save the company without sacrificing our integrity." Diego nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. I need time to think about this. Please, don't tell anyone about our conversation yet." Sophie agreed and left, her mind still spinning from the implications of what she had just learned. As she drove home, she realized she was at a crossroads. The decisions she made in the coming days would not only impact her career, but the lives of hundreds of people. That night, Sophie barely slept. She tossed and turned, weighing her options, desperately searching for a solution that could save the company without compromising her ethics. What Sophie didn't know was that her conversation with Diego was just the beginning. In the days that followed, she would be swept up in a storm of events that would test her integrity, her compassion, and her resolve like never before. As the sun rose, marking the start of a new day, Sophie got up exhausted but determined. She knew she was facing the biggest challenge of her life, but she was resolved to meet it with the same kindness and strength that had brought her this far. Little did she know, her decisions in the coming days would not only change her life, but have repercussions that reached far beyond the gas station and her small community. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions for Sophie. On one hand, she felt a deep loyalty to Diego and the company that had given her a second chance. On the other, her sense of ethics and integrity wouldn't let her be part of any cover-up. After sleepless nights and long discussions with Isabel and Lucy, Sophie made a decision. She couldn't stay silent, but she also didn't want to cause unnecessary harm to the company and its employees. With determination, Sophie arranged another meeting with Diego. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," Sophie began, her voice firm but kind. "And I have a proposal." Diego looked at her with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "I'm listening." I propose that we be completely transparent, Sophie said. We reveal the irregularities ourselves before anyone else does. We present a detailed plan of how we're going to fix the situation and make amends to anyone affected. We implement new controls and policies to make sure this never happens again. Diego listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Sophie finished, there was a long moment of silence. It's risky, Diego said finally. We could lose everything, or we could gain something much more valuable, Sophie replied. Trust, integrity, the chance to show that we're a company that does the right thing, even when it's hard. After what felt like an eternity, Diego nodded slowly. You're right, Sophie. You've always been right. Let's do it. The next few days were a frenzy of activity. Sophie worked tirelessly with Diego and a team of lawyers and accountants to prepare a full disclosure and action plan. When everything was ready, they called a press conference. On the day of the conference, Sophie stood beside Diego in front of a room full of journalists and anxious employees. With a clear and steady voice, Diego revealed the financial irregularities and presented their plan to rectify the situation. And now, Diego said, I'd like to introduce the person who inspired us to take this difficult but necessary step. Sophie Mendoza, our general manager. Sophie stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. She spoke about the importance of integrity in business, how a single act of kindness can spark positive change, and her vision for a company that prioritizes the well-being of its employees and community alongside financial success. The initial reaction was mixed. There was outrage over the irregularities, but also respect for the transparency and action plan. The following days were tense, with the company under intense scrutiny. However, something unexpected began to happen. Clients and suppliers, impressed by the honesty of the company, renewed their contracts. Employees, inspired by Sophie's ethical leadership, redoubled their efforts, and the local community rallied around the business that had chosen to do the right thing. Weeks after the press conference, Sophie was in her office when she received a call. It was a journalist from a major national newspaper. Ms. Mendoza, the journalist began, we're doing a story on business ethics, and your case has caught our attention. Could you tell us more about what led you to make that decision? Sophie smiled, recalling the day she helped an elderly man at the gas station. It all started with a simple act of kindness, she began. For the next hour, Sophie shared her story with the journalist, from being fired for helping Lucas to becoming general manager and making the difficult decision to disclose the financial irregularities. She spoke passionately about the importance of integrity in business and how one small act of compassion can lead to significant positive changes. By the end of the interview, the journalist was visibly moved. Ms. Mendoza, your story is truly inspiring. I think it will resonate with many people. Days later, when the article was published, the response was overwhelming. Sophie's story went viral, sparking national debates about business ethics. Invitations began pouring in for her to speak at universities and business conferences. Despite the newfound attention, Sophie never forgot her roots. She continued to manage the gas station with the same dedication and compassion as always. She established ethical training programs for all employees and even set up a fund to help customers in need, inspired by her experience with Lucas. One day, while Sophie was overseeing a new customer service initiative, a familiar car pulled into the station. It was Diego, and to her surprise, he had brought his father, Lucas. Sophie, Lucas called out, his face lighting up when he saw her. Sophie walked over, moved by the sight. Mr. Lucas, it's a pleasure to see you. How are you? I'm well, thanks to you, Lucas replied, taking Sophie's hands in his. Diego told me everything you've done. I always knew you were special. Diego's eyes shone with emotion. My father insisted on coming to see you. He wanted to thank you personally for saving the company he built. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. You don't have to thank me. I just did what I believed was right. And that, Diego said, is exactly why we're grateful. Your integrity didn't just save the company. It gave us a new purpose, a new way of doing business. As they spoke, Sophie reflected on how a single act of kindness had set off a chain of events that had transformed so many lives, including her own. That evening, back home, Sophie shared the encounter with Lucy and Isabel over dinner. "Mom," Lucy said, her eyes filled with admiration, "you've changed so many lives for the better." Isabel nodded, taking her daughter's hand. "I always knew you were destined for great things. Your kind heart is your greatest strength." Sophie looked at her family, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said. "You are my strength." As Sophie prepared for bed that night, she reflected on her journey. From being a gas station employee on the brink of despair to becoming a national example of ethical leadership, she had grown in ways she never imagined. Yet, what filled her with the most pride wasn't the professional success or the recognition. It was knowing that she had stayed true to her values and inspired others to do the same. As she closed her eyes, Sophie smiled. She didn't know what challenges the future held, but she was ready to face them with the same compassion and determination that had brought her this far. Because she had learned that it's our actions, driven by kindness and integrity, that define who we are and the impact we have on the world. And with her heart full of gratitude and hope, Sophie drifted off to sleep, ready for whatever new chapter life had in store. If you found Sophie's journey as inspiring and heartfelt as we did, don't forget to like, comment, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder of the power of kindness. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and join us on more adventures of compassion, resilience, and hope.